What can you tell me of the prophecy?
Your son is the promised king of his people.
Love your neighbor as you love yourself.
One of you will give me to my enemies.
Blasphemer! Don't be afraid. Everything is possible with God.
Son of God, February 28th, rated PG-13. Witness the story in large format theaters.
Hello everyone, it's Mark Badeka here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 72, and today I'm going to be looking at the film Son of God. So the occasion of today's episode of the NT Pod is the release in the USA of the film Son of God. It's a new Jesus film. It's been a few years since we've had a Jesus film in the cinemas, and I was naturally excited about it. It's not going to be in the nature of a full review because I did have an indirect involvement with this. Well, not with the film itself, but with the Bible series on History Channel, which was the thing that gave birth to this project. So I probably can't be kind of critical and objective and distant about it in the way that some others can. But nevertheless, I did want to recognise this interesting moment where a new Jesus film is out and record some of my own thoughts about it. Now, I thought it would be interesting to try something a bit different on today's NT Pod and do something which I've not done before, which is a quick bit of time travel. What I did was to sit down last night before going to the cinema and record what my thoughts were about what I thought I was about to go and see at the cinema. And so we'll listen to my anticipations about the film and my thoughts about what I was going to see, and then we'll come back and see what I thought about the film actually having seen it. So let's travel back to me of yesterday and listen to what I had to say then, just before going out to the cinema. Hi, it's Mark Badeka here, just recording a little insert for an episode of the NT Pod. It's, as I record this, it's 5:30pm on 28th of February 2014, and I'm about to go out to the cinema to go and see Son of God, the new movie which is produced by Mark Burnett and Roma Downey. And I'm quite excited about going to see this for lots of reasons. I mean, one is just the basic reason that I love Jesus films. I'm fascinated by Jesus films. I love the attempt to try and do a task which is almost impossible, which is to get the stories of the Gospels into some kind of compelling narrative format. And I love the whole business of how do you make it compelling? How do you get the historical context in there? What do you do with characters like Herod, with Pilate? How do you cope with the problems of potential anti-Judaism in the depiction of the Passion story and so on? And so it's definitely exciting to be from that point of view. And it's the first Jesus film that's been in the cinema for years. I mean, the last one that I saw in the cinema was The Nativity Story in 2006, which of course is just the Nativity Story. Before that, there was The Passion of the Christ, the Mel Gibson film back in 2004. And I did go to the cinema to see that, I think, 3 times altogether, maybe even 4. The first time I went to see it, I actually sneaked into a church leaders viewing. It was a bit naughty, really. I was living in Birmingham at the time, and I heard that there was going to be a preview screening for pastors and ministers and so on in the area. And I really wanted to go and see it and get to a preview. And they weren't inviting academics, and I thought, well, blow it, I'm going to sneak in. So I turned up to the cinema and just walked in confidently, and no one said anything to me. And so that was my first viewing of that film. No such luck on this occasion. I haven't got invited to any previews or anything like that, so I'm going to watch it with the Everyday Punters just down at the local cinema. And this is one of the amazing things about this film. It's actually on in all of the cinemas in our area. I mean, it's pretty widespread release, and this is the opening weekend, so it'll be interesting to see how it does. There's also some personal interest to me in it, in that this film is actually adapted from the History Channel series The Bible, which was like a big 10-hour series which was broadcast last year. It was amazingly successful in that, I mean, it had 10 million or so viewers per episode, which is astonishing for a cable show. And I had my own small involvement with that. One of the things that they did for that series is they got a whole army of academic consultants just so that they could talk to them about different aspects of the scripts, different aspects of the context and so on. So I was involved in that that project from the summer of 2011, and it was mainly just answering phone calls, answering emails, looking at scripts beforehand, watching episodes when they came out. I mean, it was really exciting to me to be involved in that kind of way in the production of a thing. I mean, I'm not saying it was a big deal or anything. Some of the other consultants you might well know the names of. There was Craig Evans was involved, Candida Moss, Helen Bond, Paula Goode. There were quite a lot of New Testament scholars that they consulted for it. But it means as a result that I got to know the Bible really well. I mean, the series, the Bible. I know the actual Bible quite well as well. But anyway, and you got to know the series, the Bible, quite well, because I spent so long with the scripts and so long with different versions of it. And then when the thing came out, I watched it several times just to sort of see, get my head around it. Now, it's going to be fascinating to me to see how they've adapted that into this movie type presentation, this feature presentation. And as I say, I've not seen it so far, so it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, one thing that will be curious will be to see how much they use the material from the Old Testament sections of the film. I mean, in the trailer, you have one or two scenes from that Old Testament section, including Moses, for example, dividing the Red Sea. So clearly they're going to do a little bit of dipping back into some of that material. Are they going to do it by flashback? I mean, how are they going to do that? And I'm interested to see how they begin the film. Are we going to go straight in with the nativity story? Are we going to see some of the marvelous material from the Bible, where you have Herod the Great, a huge fat Herod the Great, in scenes that are adapted from stories from Josephus? I mean, I'm interested to see how they integrate that into the story. I'm also interested to see how they end it, because of course the series itself goes on beyond the crucifixion and resurrection, and has a whole sequence with Paul and a brief sequence at the end with John on Patmos, representing Revelation. So it'll be interesting to see how they wrap the thing up after that. I know it has been heavily re-edited from the Bible, and some things are missing. For example, there was a controversy about the depiction of Satan in the film, because Fox News presenter said that he thought it looked like Obama, and then this kind of went viral, so they've just decided to cut that out. In a rather amusing comment on that, Roma Downey said that they had cast Satan out of the film, so it certainly isn't going to have the temptation story, and that will actually be quite unusual for a Jesus film, because most Jesus films do have the temptation story in them. So this is just my brief reflections before going to see the film, and I shall check back in when I'm back and give my opinions about the film once I've actually seen it. So I shall speak to you again soon. So that was me yesterday, looking forward to going to see the film, and now I'm back, and I'll tell you what I thought of it. It was a great experience, actually, and I mean, just for one thing, sitting in a full cinema watching a Jesus film with lots of people on a Friday evening, that itself was quite exciting for me. It was a little bit like, if you'll forgive the analogy, watching the Doctor Who 50th anniversary in the cinema when that happened last November. There's something about something that you enjoy yourself and that's part of your own particular life, sharing it in a cinema with a bigger audience. So it was that basic pleasure for me in going to see it. It was a really interesting experience watching it in the cinema, and in those reflections from last night, I was wondering how on earth they would reframe the piece, and the conceit that they use is actually very, very clever. What they do is they take John on Patmos from right at the end of the Bible TV series, where he's an old man, and this is how the Bible TV series finishes, and they put him right there at the beginning of the film, and they have him narrating the action of the drama in the first person. So you create a kind of first person narrative in this, so we end up almost like the author of the Acts of the Apostles, who has the first person plural narration. But it's more than that. It takes the first person plural that you do have in the prologue of John's Gospel, John 1:1-18, and makes that John's actual narrative of the events. So we begin with, in the beginning was the Word, and we move forward through elements of the Johannine prologue, which are slightly rewritten, and there we insert the flashbacks to the action from the first several hours of the Bible TV series. So it's a great conceit, because it enables you to frame the action with John on Patmos at the beginning and John on Patmos on the end, and then walk through some of that Old Testament material before we get to the Word becoming flesh and seeing Jesus. Purists will, of course, not be too happy with having John of Revelation the same person as John, or son of Zebedee, the same person as the author of the fourth gospel. But I think in this kind of format, it's completely acceptable to make some of those leaps, even if the New Testament scholars amongst us will sort of have a wry smile while those characters are being aligned. So John is used to bookend the piece, to frame the piece. He's used as the narrator of the piece, but not intrusively so. And he therefore replaces the narrator that we had throughout the whole of the Bible series. And we have the actor doing that work. The one downside, I suppose, of the reframing is that we lose a great deal of the nativity. And one of the things I absolutely loved about the Bible series was the way that they depicted the nativity. It's one of my favourite depictions I've ever seen of that. We get a few shots. We get the shot of Mary giving birth to Jesus. We get various different shots from that period, but it's a matter of seconds rather than a lengthy narrative. So I was a little sorry to lose that. I suppose it's kind of inevitable in trying to edit the thing down that we lose that. And at the same time, we therefore lose a lot of the political setup we had there with Herod the Great. And I love the depiction of Herod the Great. He's completely cut from this. So I mentioned that again in my comments last night, the way that the politics were set up. And at the same time, we lose not just the temptation story with Satan, and as I mentioned, but also pretty much most of the John the Baptist material from the beginning as well. John the Baptist then comes later into the narrative, where when he dies, they keep that and then they introduce a little bit of flashback to Jesus being baptized. It's actually quite a clever little technique, and I rather like the way that they move things around in the narrative. You can, after all, in film, use flashback much more extensively than you can in other formats. So it's clever to do that, given that you've got to re-edit the thing into a kind of compelling narrative. But losing much of John the Baptist, losing much of the politics of Herod the Great, also means that they lose Herod Antipas quite a bit. He's still there, but he's rather marginalised. But there I think that's quite a wise move, because what it enables the film to do is to focus specifically on the interaction between Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas. Now, these two characters really are probably the highlight of the film for me. Greg Hicks playing Pilate. Has there ever been a better Pilate? Just watching him on screen, utterly compelling. And there's something kind of brilliant about the way that they show the utter ruthlessness of Pilate. One of the things that New Testament scholars often complain about in popular presentations of the Passion is that Pilate is rather too sympathetically portrayed. He's depicted as kind of weak-willed and acceding to the requests of people who he almost seems to regard as more powerful than him. And in this, it's very clear right from the beginning that he is utterly ruthless. They make Pilate rather like the Pilate of Philo. Philo said that he was an inflexible, merciless and obstinate man. That's exactly what we get in this depiction. So the very first scene that we see in the film as Pontius Pilate is coming into Jerusalem depicts him as a sadistic, nasty piece of work. And the obstinacy comes in that Claudia, his wife, keeps telling him that she's had this dream about Jesus and that Jesus is righteous, and Pilate resists this. So I think he's wonderfully played. And likewise, Adrian Schiller, who plays Caiaphas, superb character study. He's not the nasty caricature baddie that you see in The Passion of the Christ. Rather, he's troubled. He's desperate to hold together the Jewish nation and the temple. Many times we have in the film, and in fact I think it comes through more strongly in the film than it did in the TV series, that there is a real political danger in allowing the mob to riot, the mob to rise up, to have an insurrection, and that's his primary concern, that he's looking after his people. So I think some of that is wonderful. There's a great scene as well where you have Pontius Pilate shouting at Caiaphas as if, like a headmaster in a school telling off a naughty boy. And there's something about that gets the power dynamics kind of right between the two. I've not seen the depiction of Pilate and Caiaphas done as well as this, with the exception, I would say, of the BBC HBO Passion from 2008, where I think the depiction of Pilate and Caiaphas was also outstanding. But this is really something special, and I would say undoubtedly for me one of the highlights of the film.
Today Passover begins, and your Emperor Tiberius Caesar makes you a gesture of goodwill. The release of a prisoner chosen by you. Barabbas, a dangerous agitator, or this preacher? who claims to be your king.
We have no king but Caesar.
You must decide.
I must also mention Amber Rose Reaver as Mary Magdalene. I think it's a wonderful portrait of Mary Magdalene. I am still lost in wonder and happiness to see Mary Magdalene depicted in a film, not as a reformed prostitute. And this is really only the second piece that's done this. We had the BBC HBO Passion in 2008, where Mary Magdalene is not depicted as a prostitute. And then we get it again in this film. And I think that's a real sign of how far popular culture has come, and how popular culture actually in this respect has been influenced by the scholarship. It's marvellous to see Mary Magdalene by Jesus' side through much of this film, and yet without the idea, the cliche of her as a reformed prostitute, and also without any hint that there's some sort of romantic relationship going on or anything like that. It's just beautifully played. In fact, the way that this film does things is that you really effectively end up with Jesus having 13 disciples. We have the 12, plus we have Mary Magdalene, and Mary Magdalene prominent in everything. Of course, in the historical Jesus' ministry, there were no doubt more women surrounding him, but it's one of those things in films where you have to simplify, you have to conflate characters, you have to narrow things down. So when we get in this film the raising of Lazarus, Mary of Bethany is practically absent. If you look very closely, you can see a woman standing alongside Martha, who is the main person in this, but she's not a character in her own right as she is in John's Gospel. That's fine. That's what you do when you create a film like this. You have to harmonise, you have to conflate, you have to focus on one or two specific characters. So I absolutely loved the depiction of Mary Magdalene. What about Jesus, though? I mean, Jesus, of course, is the reason that people are watching this film. He's played by Diogo Morgado, who is Portuguese. And I really found seeing him on screen this time, I was reminded of Max von Sydow, who does Jesus in The Greatest Story Ever Told back in 1964. Max von Sydow is a Swedish actor, and he's the only Swedish actor in the film, just as far as I'm aware. Morgado is the only Portuguese actor in this film. And there's something about his slightly different accent and his slightly different look that makes Jesus rather like the Jesus of John's Gospel, who is a stranger from heaven. He's someone a little bit different, a little bit outside of the norm. And I think as a viewer, it makes you stare at him, especially as he's so extraordinarily good looking. It makes you stare at him and think, who is this guy? He really seems like a stranger. He seems unusual. In fact, there's another scene which reminds me not of Greatest Story Ever Told, but of King of Kings, which was made a few years earlier, 1961. The Jesus in King of Kings was played by Jeffrey Hunter, who I also always think of in relation to Star Trek, because he played Captain Pike in the pilot of Star Trek. But Jeffrey Hunter, rather like Diogo Morgado, was extraordinarily good looking, and at the time people said, oh my goodness, this is like a teenage Jesus, a heartthrob Jesus. And the director of that film, Nicholas Ray, is the director of Rebel Without a Cause, so some people even tried to make the link between James Dean and Jeffrey Hunter. But in this, it's rather like the way that Jeffrey Hunter plays Jesus. He looks rather similar. There's a sort of traditional Western looking Jesus about him, and yet with an element of the unusual and an element of the earnest. And there's a scene in that film in King of Kings, very similar to one in this, where Jesus is depicted going home to Nazareth and going to see his mother, played in this by Roma Downey, one of the producers of the piece. And it's rather nice the way that you see Jesus coming back to the family home, and Mary getting up and seeing him, just as she does in King of Kings at the same time. Well, I said that this wouldn't be a review of the film because I was involved with the Bible before the scripting level, during the scripting level, and while the thing was in production. So I'm probably a little too close to it to be objective, but I thought nevertheless, given my interest in Jesus films and given the topic of the NT pod, it would be good to add some of my reflections. I mean, my main feeling is that like all Jesus films, it takes us ultimately back to the text. It encourages us to think imaginatively, encourages us to think creatively and critically about what's there in the text. It makes us think fresh thoughts about the characters, the politics, and the way that we depict these things. So I hope you've not found this slight departure from the normal kind of podcast too dull. But I'll be along again soon with a more normal episode of the NT Pod. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com or on Duke University's iTunes U or normal iTunes. And don't forget the NT Pod page on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to being with you again soon. Bye-bye.
I've had reports of a young prophet of Nazareth. It's rumored he works miracles. They all do.
Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God.
Pray to him, and he will listen.
5,000 came to see him. 5,000.
If you hunger for righteousness, you will be filled through me.
Who knows what Pilate will do if the crowds run out of control?
That man, Judas, he wants to help us.
I will crush any rebellion.
Save us from the Romans, Lord!
There is something unusual about him.